I've lived through winters before, but Silver Pine wasn't a winter you lived through. It was the kind that settled in and started behaving like it owned the place. The snow came early that year, too early for the locals to be comfortable about it. By the time I arrived near the logging outskirts, the roads were already buried in uneven white layers, like the land had been stitched over and forgotten. Silver Pine itself wasn't a town people passed through often. It was the kind of place you reached only if you meant to be there, or if something forced you off course. Most of it was old logging territory now. Deeper in the forest still stood untouched, dense pine clusters stretching so far they swallowed sound. That's where I was headed. A temporary job, serving old routes for a company that wanted to reopen access roads. Nothing unusual on paper. But from the moment I crossed the last paved stretch, something felt off. The radio in my truck stopped picking up stations even though I was still within range. Not static, just absence, like all signals had been cut clean out of the air. The deeper I drove, the quieter everything became. Even the tires sounded wrong on the snow, not crunching the way they should, more like dragging through something softer underneath. Then I saw the first set of tracks. At first I thought it was a deer path cutting across the road, but the deeper I looked, the more it didn't match anything I knew. They were spaced too far apart, too heavy, and they didn't follow a natural rhythm. They stuttered, like whatever made them didn't walk in a straight pattern. It corrected itself between steps. I stopped the truck. I remember sitting there longer than I should have, staring at those impressions in the snow while the engine idled and the forest beyond the road just stood there. No wind, no birds, no movement at all. That's when I noticed something else. The tracks weren't just crossing the road, they were coming back toward the trees, as if whatever made them had turned around and was now walking deeper into the forest again, slowly, like it wanted to be followed. I followed the tracks. That was the first mistake, though I didn't recognize it as a mistake at the time. It felt more like curiosity pulling me forward than any real decision. The kind of curiosity that doesn't ask permission from caution. The forest line of Silver Pine doesn't look like other forests from a distance. It doesn't rise gently or spread evenly. It gathers, thickens, presses itself into the landscape like it's been dropped there rather than grown. The moment I left the road, the snow changed under my boots. On the roadside, it had been loose, airy, shifting with every step. Inside the trees, it felt compacted, heavy, almost packed down in places where nothing should have walked recently. And still, the tracks continued. They led between the pines without hesitation, cutting deeper into the forest in a way that suggested certainty, not wandering, not searching, direct movement. Like whatever made them already knew the route. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. At first I told myself that was normal, forests do that. They absorb sound, they isolate. Pine didn't just remove sound, it felt like it was removing response. Even my breathing seemed less noticeable after a while, like the air was refusing to carry it. I stopped once to check the prints again. Up close, they looked worse. The shape was wrong in a way that made my eyes hesitate to interpret it, like my brain was trying to force it into something familiar: bear, wolf, maybe even a human boot. But none of those explanations fit cleanly. The impressions were too deep for the weight they suggested, and too spaced for anything that size to move normally. I remember kneeling there for a moment, gloved fingers hovering just above the edge of one of the prints, trying not to press into it, because something about it didn't feel dead. It felt recent, like if I waited long enough, I might hear it again. Somewhere deeper in the trees, a branch snapped. I froze instantly, not because of the sound itself, but because of how controlled it was. It wasn't the random crack of frozen wood breaking under its own tension. It was placed, intentional. A single break followed by silence again, like something had tested whether I was paying attention. I stood up slowly. The tracks continued ahead without deviation, but now I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There were other marks beside them, fainter, older, some half buried under layers of snow, others partially erased by wind and time, and they weren't all going in the same direction. Some led deeper into the forest, some came back out toward the road, and a few simply stopped. Not faded, not dragged away, just ending mid-step, as if whatever made them had stopped existing at that exact moment. That was the first time I felt it properly. Not fear, not dragged away, just ending mid-step. Something closer to discomfort that didn't have a name. A sense that the forest wasn't just large, it was layered, like paths were overlapping in ways they shouldn't. I checked my phone out of instinct. No signal. That didn't surprise me. What did surprise me was the battery. It had dropped nearly 20% in the time I'd been walking. Not enough to be impossible, but enough to feel wrong. Cold drains batteries, sure, but not like this. Not that fast. I looked back toward the road. The trees behind me were already starting to blur together, not visually, but directionally. I could still see where I came from, but it didn't feel like I could reach it quickly anymore. Like distance had quietly increased without warning. Then I heard it again, a second sound, not a branch this time. Footsteps, slow, somewhere ahead, not crunching through snow like mine. Softer, more like weight pressing down and releasing without resistance. I stayed still, waiting, listening. And that's when I realized something that made my chest tighten in a way I didn't expect. The tracks I had been following were no longer just going forward. They were circling, very subtly, very gradually, not turning back, not changing direction outright, but bending, like the forest itself was guiding them into a loop I hadn't noticed until it was already forming around me. And somewhere deeper in Silver Pine, something moved again. But this time it didn't snap a branch. It didn't announce itself. It simply shifted position, as if it already knew I had started paying attention. I should have turned back. That thought came to me only later, the way obvious things always do when you're already too deep into them. At the time, I just kept moving, not fast, not panicked, just continuing. because stopping felt worse than going forward, and going backward no longer felt like an option I fully understood anymore. The forest of silver pine had changed again without me noticing exactly when it happened. It wasn't denser in a physical sense. It was more like the space between trees had stopped being reliable. Distances felt inconsistent. A tree that looked 20 steps away took 30 to reach. A narrow gap between two trunks widened when I approached it, then narrowed again once I passed through. At first, I tried to explain it away as snow glare, exhaustion, maybe even uneven terrain under the snow cover, but explanation don't help when your body starts disagreeing with them. The tracks I had been following were still there, but now they weren't behaving like a path anymore. They were behaving like a conversation. They would appear clearly for a stretch, deep, defined impressions in the snow, then softer, then soft fade slightly, and reappear again farther ahead, as if they were deciding where I should be looking next, not leading me in a straight line, directing me in stages. I stopped again, this time not because I wanted to examine the prints, but because I realized I had lost the ability to tell whether I was following them or being led by them. That distinction matters more than people think, because following implies choice. Being led implies surrender. The forest around me felt closer now, even though I hadn't changed direction. The air had thickened slightly, not with fog exactly, but with presence, a heaviness that made each breath feel like it had to pass through something before reaching me. I looked back over my shoulder. The path behind me was already less distinct than it should have been. My footprints were still there, but they looked older than they had any right to. Softened at the edges, as if time itself had started smoothing them out. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. There were other prints beside mine now, not overlapping, not crossing, parallel, matching my pace exactly, but only visible for a few steps before fading again into untouched snow. I stared at them for a long time, trying to convince myself it was just shadow interference, just uneven light between the trees. But deep down, I knew what it meant. Whatever was ahead of me was no longer the only thing moving in this forest. A sound came from somewhere to my left. Not a snap, not a call. A slow, dragging shift through snow, like something repositioning itself without urgency. I turned slowly, expecting to see movement between the trees, but there was nothing, only the same stillness, the same silence that didn't feel natural anymore, and yet I could feel it now. Not hear it, not see it, just the certainty that something had adjusted its position because I had stopped walking, like the forest itself was responding to my attention. And for the first time since I entered Silver Pine, I understood that the tracks were never meant to be followed out. They were meant to be followed in. I didn't realize I was walking faster until my breathing started changing. Not because I was tired, because something about the space around me had shifted again, and my body was reacting to it before my mind could catch up. The forest of Silver Pine had a way of doing that, making you respond first and understand later. The tracks were still ahead of me, but they no longer felt like something I was following. They felt like something I was approaching on purpose. even when I wasn't sure I had chosen that direction. The deeper I went, the more the trees started to feel arranged rather than grown. Not in a human sense, no clear pattern or design, but in a way that suggested alignment, like every trunk had settled into a position relative to something I couldn't see. I remember noticing that the light between branches had changed, not brighter or darker, just less honest. Shadows didn't fall in a way that matched the snow anymore. They stretched slightly too far in some places and not far enough in others, as if depth itself had started miscalculating. Then I saw the tracks again, except this time they weren't just forward, they were branching, not splitting naturally like an animal changing direction, but forming choices that appeared only after I got close enough to see them. One path veered left into thicker pine clusters, another continued forward, a third curved subtly back toward where I had just come from. I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, staring at them, because something about it felt wrong on a level I couldn't easily explain. It wasn't just navigation anymore, it was invitation, like the forest was offering me versions of the same decision, waiting to see which one I would accept, and which one I chose. Whichever I chose would become the only one that ever existed. A wind passed through the trees then, but it didn't behave like wind. It moved in sections. One tree swayed slightly while the other beside it remained completely still. Then the motion jumped forward a few meters as if the wind had skipped space. I felt it brush against the back of my neck, cold enough that I instinctively turned around. Nothing there, of course. But the feeling didn't leave. It stayed behind me now, aligned with my movement, as if something had positioned itself just outside my attention and was pacing me at the exact speed I walked. I looked down at the tracks again, and that's when I noticed something that made my stomach tighten hard. The prints weren't only guiding me forward anymore, they were adjusting to my hesitation. Every time I paused, the spacing between them changed slightly, compressing when I stopped, stretching when I moved again, not randomly, responsively. Like the forest was learning the rhythm of my doubt. And then, very faintly, I heard it. Not a voice, not a sound I could fully recognize. More like pressure forming in the air behind me, shaping itself into something almost familiar. A low, patient exhale that didn't come from any single direction. It came from the space between the trees. And for the first time since I entered Silver Pine, I stopped trusting that I was the one deciding where I was walking. I didn't turn immediately. That's the part I still remember most clearly, how long I stood there pretending I hadn't heard it, as if ignoring it could keep it from becoming real. The forest stayed still while I did it. No birds, no wind, no movement in the branches. Only that slow pressure in the air behind me, like something had leaned closer without actually crossing the distance. When I finally did turn, it was careful, slow, controlled, like sudden movement might give the forest permission to respond. There was nothing behind me in the obvious sense. No shape standing between the trees, no shadow shifting where it shouldn't. Just the same dense arrangement of pine trunks and snow-covered ground fading into darkness. But the feeling didn't disappear. It had relocated, not gone, just redistributed into the space around me, like whatever I had sensed wasn't fixed to a body anymore. It was tied to awareness itself. I took a few steps backward instinctively, trying to reorient myself toward the tracks again. That's when I noticed something that made my breath catch slightly. My footprints. They weren't alone anymore. They still showed my path clearly in the snow, but now there were faint disturbances beside them, matching distance, matching rhythm, keeping pace with every step I had taken. Not overlapping, not crossing, just parallel impressions forming where nothing visible had walked. I crouched again, leaning closer, and for the first time, I noticed that the edges of those prints weren't crisp like mine. They were softened at the center, as if something had pressed down and withdrawn carefully, leaving only the idea of pressure behind, a movement without commitment. I stood up quickly after that, faster than I intended, and then the forest responded, not loudly, not dramatically, just subtly. The silence tightened. That's the only way I can describe it, like the entire space between the trees had drawn in slightly closer to me. I started walking again, following the tracks more urgently now, not because I trusted them, but because standing still felt worse. The deeper I moved, the more the trees began to repeat themselves. Not identical trees, but identical positions. A pine on my left would appear again a few meters ahead, same lean, same broken branch, same snow pattern around its base. At first I thought I was circling without realizing it, but then I noticed the subtle shift. Each repetition wasn't exact, it was improved, like the forest was correcting its own version of itself each time I passed through it again. I remember stopping once more, trying to force logic into it, but logic doesn't hold well in places that refuse to behave consistently. That's when I saw something deeper between the trees, far ahead. Not moving quickly, not rushing, just standing in a gap where the forest opened slightly wider than it should have. A shape, tall, still, not fully defined, like my eyes couldn't decide what distance it belonged to. And around it, the snow seemed darker, not with shadow but with absence of reflection. It didn't move when I saw it. It didn't react. It just remained there as if it had been positioned specifically at the point where my attention would eventually land. I should have turned away. I should have left the tracks immediately. But instead, I realized something that made my throat tighten. The tracks I had been following were leading directly toward it. I didn't move at first, not because I was trying to be brave, and not because I thought I understood what I was seeing. It was more like my body refused to accept a decision until my mind caught up. The shape between the trees stayed exactly where it was. No shift, no hesitation, just presence held in place in a way that made the surrounding forest feel less real by comparison. The snow around it looked wrong again, not disturbed, not untouched, more like it had forgotten how to reflect light properly in that exact area, as if the world had briefly stopped rendering detail there. I remember slowly lowering my gaze back to the tracks. That was worse, because now I could see the truth I had been avoiding. They didn't just lead toward the shape, they tightened toward it. The spacing between each impression shortened as it got closer, like whatever made them was slowing down or becoming more careful the nearer it approached that point. as if respect and fear were the same thing in this place. A sound came again, not behind me this time, not ahead either, just around. A soft pressure shifting through the snow-laden silence, like something moving without needing to announce direction. The trees closest to me creaked slightly, not from wind, from weight that wasn't touching them directly. I took one step back without meaning to, and immediately regretted it, because the moment I moved, the shape ahead reacted, not by stepping forward, not by changing position, but by becoming clearer, more defined, as if my attention had given it permission to exist in higher resolution. That's when I understood something I didn't want to understand. It wasn't waiting for me to reach it. It was waiting for me to recognize it fully. And recognition, I realized, might be the same thing as arrival. The tracks behind me had almost faded now, partially buried under fresh, unnatural stillness settling into the snow. Ahead, they continued, leading directly into the space beneath the figure, and I left it then. Not sound, not motion, a certainty pressing gently against my thoughts, like something had noticed that I had finally stopped pretending I didn't see it. The figure shifted slightly for the first time, not stepping, not turning, just aligning its presence toward me in a way that suggested awareness tightening. And for a brief moment, I swear the forest itself leaned in with it, not physically, but conceptually, as if everything around me had agreed, silently, that this was the point I was supposed to reach. And then I heard something behind me again, closer than before, not approaching, already arrived at the edge of understanding, and I realized I was no longer alone in the tracks, not in front, not in behind, but inside the path itself. I finally broke into motion again, but it wasn't a decision that felt like mine. It felt like pressure releasing, like standing still had become more dangerous than whatever came next. The moment I moved forward, the forest changed its behavior again, not dramatically, not visibly, but in the way it responded to me. The space between trees tightened slightly as if acknowledging progress. The snow under my boots felt more compact in certain areas, almost as if I was being guided along a firmer surface that wasn't fully visible. The tracks ahead remained steady, continuing directly into the deeper line of pines where the shape stood waiting. But now there was something else, a second rhythm. Not beside the tracks, not crossing them, but embedded within them, like something was pacing my movement from inside the same path. I stopped noticing my breathing after a while, not because I stopped breathing, but because it stopped feeling like it belonged to me alone. Every exhale seemed to disappear too quickly into the forest, absorbed before it could return to my awareness properly. Then I heard it again, that same pressure sound, but closer now. Not behind me this time, not ahead, above. I looked up slowly. The trees were tall, dense, their branches overlapping in layers that blocked most of the sky, but in the small gaps I could see between them, there was movement. No branches swaying, not wind. Something shifting across the canopy level without breaking anything. No snapping, no falling snow, just displacement. Like weight moving carefully across invisible supports above the forest floor. My instinct told me not to stop walking, so I kept going. Step after step, trying to maintain rhythm, trying to convince my body that steady movement meant control. But control is an illusion that collapses fast in places like Silver Pine. The tracks ahead began to narrow again, not physically shrinking, but focusing. All branching options I had seen earlier were gone now. Every possible deviation had disappeared from the snow. Only one line remained, straight, unbroken, direct. And that was when I realized something worse than everything before it. I was no longer choosing direction at all. I was being corrected into it. The shape ahead became clearer again as I approached, not because it moved, because distance stopped protecting me from it. Its outline resolved slowly, like the forest was finally allowing me to perceive it without distortion. Tall, not unnatural in structure alone, but in proportion, like something that understood human shape but never fully committed to replicating it correctly. And around it, the snow wasn't just dark anymore, it was compressed, flattened in a wide radius, as if presence itself had weighed. Then the track stopped, right at the edge of that space, not fading, not no continuation, just ending abruptly as if the path had reached a conclusion it no longer needed to extend beyond. I stood there for a moment, longer than I should have, because there was something in that stillness that felt intentional, like the forest had delivered me exactly where it wanted me to understand I had arrived. And then the silence shifted, not broken, just adjusted, as if something inside it had turned its attention fully toward me for the first time. I didn't step forward immediately after the tracks ended. Something about that line in the snow felt like a boundary, not just a stopping point. Like crossing it won't be walking into something new, but stepping out of something familiar that had been holding me together without my permission. The figure ahead remained still. Still isn't the right word, actually. It didn't feel like it was waiting in the way humans wait. It felt like it was already positioned in completion, as if movement itself was unnecessary for it now. The forest around it had changed in subtle ways I couldn't ignore anymore. The snow closest to it wasn't simply compressed, it looked wrong in texture, too smooth in places, too rough in others, like the surface had been rewritten unevenly. Even the trees seemed to hesitate around that area, their spacing slightly inconsistent, as if they refused to commit to a fixed rearrangement near it. I took one cautious step forward, then another, not because I wanted to, because standing still had become unbearable in a different way, like the space behind me was no longer safe either. As I crossed where the tracks had ended, something strange happened under my boots. The snow didn't crunch, it yielded, softly, like I was walking over something that wasn't fully solid anymore. My stomach tightened immediately. I looked down. For a moment, I thought I saw depth beneath the surface, not ground, not ice. Something layered underneath, too dark, too uniform, like the forest had thickness that extended beyond what snow should be covering. I stepped back instinctively. The sensation disappeared. Stepped forward again. There it was. That's when I stopped pretending this was normal terrain. The forest wasn't just covering the ground anymore. It was hiding it or replacing it. I looked up at the figure again. It had not moved, but something about its presence felt closer now. Even though the distance between us hadn't changed, that's when I noticed the second detail. The air around it wasn't cold, not warm either, just absent of temperature entirely. Like that space had stopped participating in normal conditions, and within that absence, the snowflakes falling nearby weren't falling correctly. They drifted sideways, paused mid-air for fractions of a second, then continued in slightly altered directions, as if gravity itself was uncertain near it. I took another step. This time, I didn't feel the ground properly at all. It was like walking on a surface that was remembering how to be solid. And then I heard something behind me again, not movement this time, not footsteps, a settling sound, like the forest had shifted its attention and locked the space I had just left into place. I didn't turn, I couldn't afford to, because in that moment I realized something that made my chest tighten completely. The forest wasn't just leading me forward anymore, it was closing behind me, and the only direction it was still allowing was toward the thing that had been waiting without moving at all. I kept moving forward, but by then, forward didn't feel like direction anymore. It felt like permission. Every step into that flattened snow space pulled me deeper into something that wasn't behaving like terrain. The ground didn't resist my weight the way it should have. It accepted it, quietly, as if I had finally reached the part of the forest where resistance was no longer necessary. The figure ahead remained unchanged in posture, still tall, still wrong in proportions that never fully resolved, no matter how long I looked at it. But the closer I got, the more I noticed something I wish I hadn't. It wasn't just standing in the snow, it was standing in a difference. Like the air around it belonged to a slightly separate version of the forest, one that didn't align perfectly with everything else I had walked through. I stopped again without meaning to. My body just refused to continue for a moment. And in that pause, the silence changed, not louder, not quieter, more directed, like it had finally decided to address me instead of surrounding me. Then I heard it, not a voice in the normal sense, no sound entering my ears, more like a thought forming too clearly to ignore, except it wasn't coming from inside me, it was coming from the space ahead. No words first, a sensation, recognition, and then, slowly, meaning shaped itself out of it. Not spoken, understood. Something like my name, except not my name exactly, more like the concept of me being identified without language needing to translate it properly. I froze instantly because nothing in the forest should have been able to do that. Nothing should have been able to single me out like that. The figure didn't move, but the awareness behind it tightened. That's the only way I can describe it. Like attention becoming concentrated, focused, intentional. And then the pressure in the air shifted again, and I felt something I hadn't felt before in Silver Pine. Expectation, not aggression, not hunger. Expectation that I would respond. I tried to step back. It didn't compress naturally. It resisted, softly at first, then firmly enough that I stopped immediately. That's when I understood the shape of what was happening. Forward was not just allowed, backward was no longer valid. The forest wasn't chasing me, it had simply removed alternatives. I looked at the figure again, and for the first time, I saw something subtle change. Not its body, not its position, but the space around its head. A slight distortion, like heat above fire, but colder, sharper, more structured. And inside that distortion, I felt like the awareness behind it become clearer. Not animal, not human, not even predatory in a simple sense. Something that understood presence in a way that didn't require motion. Then, very faintly, the forest around me responded, not with sound, but with agreement, as if everything had quietly acknowledged that this point had been reached exactly as intended. And I realized, standing there in that impossible snow, It had known I would come long before I ever saw the tracks. I stood there longer than I should have, not because I was deciding anything, but because my body had stopped trusting that movement would still behave normally. Everything in Silver Pine felt like it had shifted into a different set of rules, and I was only now noticing I was still trying to use the old ones. The figure ahead remained unchanged, but the space around it kept refusing to stabilize in my vision. It was like looking at something that the forest itself couldn't fully agree on how to render. Sometimes it looked closer, sometimes farther, sometimes too defined to be real, sometimes too undefined to be anything else, and each time my focus sharpened it, it corrected itself again, not reacting to fear, reacting to attention. That was the detail I couldn't shake anymore. It didn't care that I was afraid, it cared that I was looking. Behind me, the forest had completely sealed off the sense of return now. I didn't need to turn to know it. The air had already changed in that direction, heavier, quieter, like that part of the world had been gently erased from active possibility. Even my own footprints behind me didn't feel reachable anymore, not physically, conceptually. Like retracing steps would lead nowhere, even if the snow still showed them. Then the figure finally moved, not forward, not toward me. It tilted slightly, just enough that the awareness behind it aligned more directly with my position. And in that instant, I felt something inside my thoughts shift, not inserted, not spoken, recognized. Like the forest wasn't discovering me for the first time, it was confirming something it had already recorded long before I arrived. A memory I didn't remember living through. That sensation spread slowly through everything, my breath, my heartbeat, even the way I was perceiving distance. And then I realized something that made my chest tighten harder than anything before it. The tracks I had followed were never guiding me toward this moment. They were verifying I would still arrive at it the same way, as if every step I took had already been tested against an outcome I couldn't change. The snow beneath me shifted again, not collapsing, not moving, but becoming certain. Like the forest had finally completed its measurement of where I was supposed to stand. The figure ahead didn't advance. It didn't need to, because the distance between us no longer felt like space. It felt like alignment. And then, for the first time since I entered the Silver Pine, I understood what the silence had been doing the entire time. It wasn't hiding sound, it was removing anything that could disagree with what was about to happen next. I remember thinking very clearly that I should be terrified, but the fear didn't arrive the way it should have. It came in fragments instead, small interruptions in thought, a tightening in the chest that never fully developed into panic, a pressure behind the eyes that refused to become tears, like my body was being gently prevented from completing its normal responses. The forest of Silver Pine felt even closer now, though nothing had physically changed around me. It was more like everything had stopped pretending there was space between things. Even the air felt layered, not thick, layered, like I was standing inside multiple versions of the same place that hadn't fully separated from each other. The figure ahead remained in place, still, but no longer distant in any meaningful sense. I could feel it without needing to focus on it directly. That was the worst part. It didn't require attention anymore. It simply existed in a way that included me. The snow beneath my boots had stopped behaving like snow entirely. Each step felt like pressing into something that was no longer sure it was supposed to support weight, but allowed it anyway out of something close to obligation. Then something changed again, not in the forest, in me. My thoughts stopped moving in a straight line. They began looping quietly around certain ideas without finishing them. The word tracks stopped meaning direction. The word forest stopped meaning place. Even the idea of following started to lose structure. And in that unraveling, something else began to form. Not spoken, not heard, but recognized in the same way you recognize something you forgot you once know. The presence ahead wasn't getting closer. It was becoming more complete, as if distance itself was irrelevant to its ability to be perceived. I tried to look away for the first time, but my attention didn't obey properly. It drifted back almost immediately, not forced, just corrected, like the forest didn't allow incomplete observation anymore. That's when I realized something I still don't fully understand. The figure wasn't waiting for me to arrive at it physically, it was waiting for me to reach the point where I could no longer define anything around it as separate. And that point was already happening. Behind me, the forest sealed itself completely, not with sound, not with movement, but with finality, like a sentence ending without punctuation. And for the first time since I entered the Silver Pine, I couldn't clearly remember what it felt like to stand somewhere that wasn't already aware of me. I don't know what people would call the moment after that. An ending would be the wrong word, because nothing actually stopped, nothing collapsed, nothing revealed itself in a clean, understandable way the way stories usually pretend things do. It was more like the forest simply reached completion. The figure ahead never rushed toward me. It never needed to. By the time I understood I had arrived, arrival had already lost meaning. Distance had already been removed from the equation. There was only presence now, mine, and something else that had always been there, just waiting for the rest of me to catch up. The snow beneath my boots no longer felt like ground, not unstable, not shifting, just fully redefined as something that no longer needed to behave like terrain at all. Even the trees felt less like objects and more like confirmations, silent witnesses that no longer required arrangement because arrangement had already been decided long before I noticed them. The figure remained still, but stillness wasn't absence of motion anymore, it was completeness. Like movement was unnecessary because nothing was left unresolved in its position, and then something happened that I still can't describe properly, even after all this time. The awareness around me expanded, not outward, not inward, just everywhere at once. And in that expansion, the separation I had been holding on to between myself and everything else started to loosen, not violently, not suddenly, just steadily, like a knot being undone without anyone pulling it. I remember trying very briefly to think of my name, to anchor myself to something specific, but even that felt distant, not forgotten, just unnecessary. The forest didn't respond with sound, it didn't need to. Instead, everything around me aligned in a way that made questioning feel irrelevant. The tracks I had followed were no longer visible, not erased, not covered, simply no longer needed to exist. because I wasn't being guided anymore. There was no direction left to give, only recognition. And in that final clarity, I understood what Silver Pine truly was. Not a place, not a hunt, not even a warning. It was a system of remembering, and once you entered it far enough, it stopped trying to show you the way out, because it had already decided you were no longer something that needed to leave. And the last thing I still can recall with any certainty is this: the forest didn't consume me, it didn't kill me, it didn't even trap me in the way that word is actually or usually understood. It simply reached a point where I could no longer define myself outside of it, and when that happened, there was nothing left to return from, only Silver Pine. And whatever it decides, you become when you stop resisting it.